Hello, everyone, and welcome to our conversation today. The title of this discussion is Who Gets Credit? Exploring Gendered and Invisible Labor at Work. My name is Eric Ginsberg. I'm the social media manager here at the Center for Creative Leadership. And for this discussion today, I'm joined by two of my incredible colleagues, Allison Barr and Diane Bergeron. In a second, I'm going to ask both of them to introduce themselves. But before I do, just want to ask all of you who are tuning in, tell us where you're watching from. We want to get a sense of who's joining us today. So also, please share your insights and questions with us throughout this discussion. It will enrich our conversation, and we'll do our best to answer a few audience questions at the end as time allows. So Diane, welcome. Will you kick us off and introduce yourself?
Sure. Thanks, Eric. My name is Diane Bergeron. I'm a senior research scientist at Center for Creative Leadership. I'm a social organizational psychologist with a PhD from Columbia, and I'm in Connecticut within the United States.
Great. Thank you. And again, welcome. Allison, you may be a familiar face to some of our audience if they've tuned into these live streams before, but please introduce yourself as well.
Sure. Thanks, Eric. Hi, everyone. I'm Allison Barr. I'm a leadership solutions partner at CCL, which is another way of saying faculty. My background is in psychology and international business. I have my MBA and a master's degree in psychology. Geographically, technically, I'm located in Colorado, but today I'm in a hotel traveling actually for a women's leadership program. Happy to be here.
Perfect. And I feel like that illustrates exactly why Diane and Allison have joined us today when you hear about their background. I want to also call out, Allison didn't mention, but she's the co-lead of our Women's Employee Resource Group here at CCL, which is just one more credential worth calling out for this discussion. So to our audience, I invite you to share with us what you hope to gain from this discussion and call out, as we go, any key takeaways that you have along the way. I know that Allison and Diane are going to say a lot of really insightful things, myself not so much, but as they say things that resonate with you, call those out so that we can highlight them for other participants as well. Let's start at the beginning for this discussion. Part of the reason we want to have this conversation is the extensive research, Diane, that you've done over the years connecting gender and our understandings of leadership, or how our conceptions of good leadership aren't necessarily inclusive. So just to start, what motivated you to start this focus area in your research?
Sure. Thanks, Eric. So when I was working on my dissertation, I had to come up with a topic, and I was uncertain what I wanted to do. And I kept coming back to this kind of underground paper called Organizational Wives. And it was about how women tend to take on this wifely role in organizations, and it can kind of distract them from, their tasks. And at the same time, there were 3 instances where I could think of people I had seen in organizations. So in one, there was a faculty member who, she was kind of the good citizen of the department, and she did all these extra helping behaviors, and yet she was one of the few people that wasn't promoted. And then I could see the same issue in a consulting firm I worked at, where at the same level, there were these 4 practice leaders. 1 was female, 3 were male. She was the one that did all these helping behaviors for the department. And yet when promotion time came around, she was the only one that wasn't promoted. And so I started thinking, is there this link between being this kind of organizational wife and being held back in terms of career advancement? And so that's how I became interested in this.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. I guess a follow-up question either for you, Diane, or Allison, when you're talking about these types of behaviors, do any of you have examples of what that might look like, how that shows up?
Yeah, I mean, fortunately or unfortunately, I could give you so many. So I think some of the examples are one common one is asking women to be the note taker, asking women to be the organizer of celebrations, whether it's a birthday or somebody else getting promoted, getting coffee for people. Mentoring is another one. And oftentimes seeing women in the training role, more the helping roles. And I'm curious, Diane, what you would add to that.
There's a long list of things. I mean, the actual name for these behaviors is organizational citizenship behavior. So it can be, sharing your expertise, passing on information, mentoring people, conserving organizational resources. The list is almost limitless because it's kind of all the extra things that you could do in your organization, but that you're not required to.
Thank you both for adding that context. I'm sure, at least for me, as you both gave those examples, I start ticking through different jobs I had and who took on that kind of work and situations where I didn't take on that kind of work. So I appreciate you both calling that out. I'm curious for people in the audience, have you seen yourself on either side of this coin, and how does it align to what Allison and Diane are saying? So Diane, what has we were talking about like sort of how you got started and what this can look like. What have you found in your research? What are some, I mean, you talked a little bit about this, but what are some patterns or common themes that you've identified?
Right. So this topic, organizational citizenship behavior, you can think of it as just kind of workplace helping behaviors. One point I want to make is that these things, based on research, really do make organizations more effective in terms of efficiency, effectiveness, profitability, customer satisfaction, reduced waste, like on pretty much every metric. These organizations want these behaviors. The problem is, because in society we expect women to help more, they tend to be the ones that are more likely to take on these helping behaviors in the organization. And I'm not saying it's just women, because men and women do these behaviors. Women are expected to do them. And because they're expected to do them, they're less likely to get rewarded for them than men. And sometimes women can even be penalized when they don't do them. And so I studied this in a consulting firm and also in academia in research universities. And with the academic population, we found that people that did these helping behaviors, spent too much time on them, had fewer research publications, which is what you need to get tenure in research universities. They advanced more slowly in their career, and they were more likely to plateau at a certain level. And then in the consulting firm, it was kind of the same thing. They had fewer billable hours, they had lower salary increases, and again, it took them longer to get promoted to the next rank.
That's really helpful to have that context. I mean, I think, like I was saying, like anecdotally, I've seen or been a part of in some ways the situations that you're both describing, but having that like larger research framing, I think helps ground this conversation too. Allison, we mentioned at the beginning, you're the co-lead of our Women's Employee Resource Group, and we did not plan it this way on purpose, but you are literally out there facilitating a program. I think we lost her for a second, but I wanted to ask, about her insights for how she's seen this show up. Diane, can you talk a little bit more about the ways in which, you talked about that these are things that men and women do, but that women are expected to do, but also how that's not part of people's job descriptions typically. And yet it provides this tremendous value to organizations. Do you have any insights on why this is so valuable and why it's not formally part of anyone's job?
Well, because I think you can never specify in advance all the things that organizations need to function, right? Like we can specify the main things, but all of those little things, right? And if you think of a factory, unions often have that, it's something like a work to rule, where if they don't want to go on strike, they only do what's in their job description and everything stops, right? So it's the same thing in organizations. And the other point I would make is, we know also from research, you do get higher performance evaluations if you do these helping behaviors. And I think that's where people can get into trouble, because to me, it's almost like a pat on the back effect if you get a higher performance evaluation, but that does not also equal, eventually either a salary increase or a promotion or something like that. And especially if it tends to slow you down because you're not as focused on the things that the organization really cares about.
Great points. And I'm sure I want to hear from the audience. I know for me, when you say like the union example of work to rule and do only what's in your job description, I think most organizations would completely fall apart if people did that. Allison, it reminds me of the last time you were live with us when we were talking about, quiet quitting and does anyone want to work anymore, and like all these expectations that get added on to people's plates. beyond their role. But curious for you, Allison, if you see any ties there, and also just as the co-lead of our women's employee resource group or facilitating programs like you are this week about women's leadership, how do you see all this playing out?
Well, women are still leaving the workforce at tremendous rates, and it's because of this, right? Their plates are completely overloaded. And additional research has shown that women receive 44% more requests to volunteer their time for modal tasks than men. And that's regardless of the gender of the manager making requests. Women make those requests of women as well. And Diane may have mentioned this already, but the type of stereotypes assumptions, they do harm women's experience at work, as well as their potential for growth. When women are spending the limited time that we have, their mental effort and emotional energy on unpaid, non-promotable work, we're not able to use resources for strategic work that would then advance our careers. So, I think it's also important to note that there's a tremendous amount of nuance to this as well. Mm-hmm. And Eric, you and I have talked about this before, but it's really crucial to acknowledge that not all women have the same lived experience. Some women want to take notes, and that's okay, right? That's all right. And it's okay to just name the history of all of this and acknowledge that there's generational inheritance to all this and why that's relevant now. So the history of women in the workplace in the US, not all women were allowed to enter the workplace at the same time. And when they were given helping roles. And so that feels like it was a very long time ago, but we're only one generation removed from that. And it's okay to name that. It's not to say that everyone in that generation holds those oppressive beliefs, but really generational legacies have certainly been inherited, and they exist at the workplace today. So today's generation is still seeing women of color being tremendously left behind, as evidenced by being the least represented in organizations as well as in leadership roles too. So it's important to acknowledge this, because supporting women means supporting all of them and understanding how identities and life experience can cause deeper levels of obstacles.
Right. And I'd like to build on because Allison, those are great points. And Eric, there's a term for that. So we call it cultural taxation. So if you are a member, especially a woman, of a non-dominant group in your organization, not only do you have all the expectations of being a female or a woman, but you also have the expectations of that group. And so one way you see this is, and this would make me crazy when I saw this, but in one organization I was in, every time there was a task force or a committee put together, the phrase was, oh, well, we need diversity of participants. They always called on the same Black male or Black female to be part of the committee. And in their view, they feel like they're being inclusive. But I remember thinking, but this is this person's time, right? Like, what about the impact on their career? And I think that's where, sometimes we're less cognizant of that.
Yeah, those are both great examples and important context. You both interpreted my next question, which is sort of like, how does this play out across different social identities, or if we consider, like, if we look beyond a gender binary, anything that the two of you would want to add if we were going to take this a little deeper? Do you feel like you both covered it and I should just jump because you anticipated my next question well?
Well, I mean, maybe we can come back to this, but I was kind of thinking about this over the weekend and just thinking how entwined these expectations of women in the workplace are entwined with expectations of women at home, right? And so that kind of caretaking, it's both ways. And I think it's not fully going to be fixed in the workplace until it's fixed at home.
Yeah, and I would add to that, at CCL, we talk a lot about leadership starting from within and self-awareness being a crucial component of that. You are the same person at work. When you leave work, you are the same person. And so acknowledging that the belief systems that you hold, to Diane's point, the belief systems that you hold are the belief systems that you hold. It's important to investigate what your beliefs are about women and what roles they should play in your mind, and challenging them, because your beliefs will drive your behavior regardless of where you are. The workplace exists in your environment. It's the same. So investigating those beliefs is a really crucial place to start.
I appreciate you both adding that in. Nothing I want to add there. I think you both said it perfectly, but you both started to touch on this, like what do we do? And I want to get to that part of the conversation. Let's talk about some potential solutions. I mean, I guess to start, what role do you see men playing in this conversation? I ask that partly because I think some men, and I've done this myself sometimes, want to see things change, don't know necessarily how to do that, and so think that maybe the best thing for us, people that identify as men like myself, the best thing for us to do is to sort of like step back and stay out of the way. And I'm not sure that's the right answer here. So let's start there. Like what role, if any, should men play in changing this equation?
So Eric, I would say instead of stepping back, it's stepping up, right? And so we know that mixed groups have more power to change the workplace. So I would say particularly in meetings or anytime extra work is being held out, when Allison was talking about the low promotability tasks, I know those researchers and their work shows that often in meetings, when there's kind of one of those tasks being offered up to the group, men will kind of hold back and wait for a woman to volunteer. And if she doesn't, sometimes a woman is then volunteered to do it. So, anytime you see something like that, I think it's helpful to point it out. And some, I remember hearing about an economics department where they tracked all of that. All of those tiny little things that had to get done, and of course, these are economists, so this is what they do. But they had a point system for all that kind of labor so that they could see, are things being fairly distributed?
And I would add to that, you can just exhale knowing that sometimes you're going to make a mistake, and that's okay. It's better to step up, as Diane said, than to step back. Mm-hmm. There's a difference as well between completely removing yourself and being apathetic and stepping in and being an active listener. Eric, I know you and I have talked about that before too, but without men, women are simply talking into echo chambers. And at CCL, when we talk about leadership is a social process. It's a collective process. And I can't help but go back to it. Men can start by investigating their own beliefs about women, challenging them when necessary. And, for example, if a woman says no to you, what's your immediate thought? Like, put yourself there right now. If a woman says no to you at the workplace, what's your immediate thought? Start there. Women are allowed to advocate for themselves and not be punished. And I would say that men can also use their voices and positional power to draw attention to women's contributions. And lastly for now, challenge the likability penalty that women face all the time. Eric, when's the last time you were told to be more likable?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know that I've ever been told either of those things.
Right. So likability is something that it's subjective. It's meaningless. It's not a skill set. It could mean 3 different things between the 3 of us, and it's a penalty that women face. So challenging that. I think a lot of the work that men can do is actually behind closed doors without women present.
Can you say more about that?
Sure. In my experience and from what I understand, a lot of quote unquote punishment for women happens when decisions are being made behind closed doors. For example, that likability penalty upon hiring, that's a common conversation that happens in hiring decisions. Should we put Susan in this VP role? Well, she's not very likable. So you having a voice in that space and challenging that would be really important. Invisible punishment happens at the workplace all the time. The conversations that happen between people in power positions about women. If a woman were to stick up for herself in a meeting, maybe nobody says anything in the meeting, but what happens after that meeting is the invisible punishment, the water cooler conversations, making sure that, you advocate for women as well and challenge that.
Diane, I think you were going to jump in on that too, maybe.
Well, I'm just underscoring the role that men play, because the other thing that we know from research is, well, when women try to say no, they're liked less, to Allison's point, but also people tend to push back more on women. They almost view it as not a firm no. And so they push back more, trying to get the woman to say yes, because again, there's this social role expectation that women should always be helpful. And so it's hard to push back against that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Allison, you asked earlier, like asking people to interrogate for themselves, like what their response would be if a woman says no. And I was trying to think through, and I feel like the answer that ties to what you were just saying, Diane, it would be like, well, why not? Like you said, just like the immediate pushback of like trying again.
Yes.
I saw a comment pop up on the screen from our colleague, Dr. Shelley Tompkins, that was talking about the role that men have to play because that's who's in positions of power. I think that's a important note to make. And I just want to add to that, for the men that are tuning into this discussion, we've traditionally benefited from this incomplete definition of good leadership, right? So if the way that we've been, our organizations, our culture, society has been defining this is what a good leader looks like, and that more closely matches us, then we have to also acknowledge, like, I'm asking the men that are tuning in, like, have you been asked to organize someone's birthday party in the office, or like to plan the virtual team building exercise? Like, I don't know that I ever have. And when I think back, at least to the examples that come to mind, or who is doing that work, it's been women. And Allison, you said this earlier, like, it's not that if a colleague of mine enjoys doing that work, is good at it, that we're saying like women need to stop doing that work altogether, but it's about that level of agency and expectation, right? Is that how you would both define it?
Can I
say absolutely? And it hurts men too. So I want to underline, like, all of this hurts men too. So there might be a man or a non-binary person, a non-woman who really wants to do this. And people punish men too. I know that's not what we're talking about, but I do want to highlight that it hurts everybody. Those deep-seated misogynistic beliefs and actions that men, if you host somebody's birthday party, you're seen as less than, or you're seen as less of a man. All of this hurts men too. And Diane, you were going to chime in as well.
Well, so Eric, when you said something about, well, if women are better at it, and I think that is often the justification given for why women do these tasks, as though they're better at it. And I feel like it's not better at it. It's because they've had more practice, because they're expected to do it, right? It's kind of like, at home changing diapers, like that's just a practice effect. And so I think we need to be careful of the ways that we may kind of justify not changing the status quo. And I would underscore what Allison said about, this is a system that we have inherited that does not work for everyone.
I think that's a great point. And as a new parent who's changing a lot of diapers, it's just practice. It's just practice. It's not that hard. So let's move on. I don't want to spend the whole time talking about men. For individual women tuning in, who are listening to this and you're speaking to their experience, what advice do you have to those folks who are tuning in going forward?
So I would say that one piece of advice, especially if you are starting a new role at a new organization, is you have a clean slate there. And so do not start off by kind of going above and beyond in everything that you do, right? Because the problem is, while you may get credit for that initially, over time, it just becomes part of your role. And so we call that either role creep or job creep, where unintentionally, all of a sudden your role is much bigger than you anticipated, and you're not getting the equivalent rewards for it from the organization. So that's one piece of advice I would give.
Yeah, Allison.
And I'll build on that. Get comfortable saying no. and also get comfortable listening to other women. So this is for women and men. Get comfortable listening to other women who do not share the same experience or opinions as you. I can't stress it enough that supporting women means supporting all women. And just food for thought as well. It's everyone's job. So if we only focus on women solving the problem, which I know isn't what you said, Eric, I just want to highlight this. It's everybody's responsibility to solve it, right? So if we request women to solve a problem that's inherently everybody's problem, then we're building on the things that we've already talked about. We are all capable of contributing to this, and it's hard. And it's also okay to acknowledge that it is hard and it's going to challenge you. And when you feel defensive, ask yourself why. So it's that moment that when you start to feel defensive about a woman advocating for herself, or a woman standing up for herself in a meeting, or saying, no, Eric, why don't you take notes? If you feel a trigger by that, the most important thing you can do is pause and start to investigate that. That's where you need to start.
And Eric, I would also say that, and I'm saying this because, yes, I agree with Allison. It's important to say no, and there can be pushback for saying no. So, when I talk to people, sometimes I say, well, you may not use the, that no word, but you may say, well, you know what, I think in the last 3 meetings, I was the one doing X, or, well, I did it this time, maybe so-and-so could do it, right? And even a male could offer up, well, I think this person did it, maybe this time I will do it. But the other thing is, you could establish a system so that there's a process for how that kind of work gets spread around. To me, that's the fairest thing, because, we don't always notice what's going on around us. And so women may also have to speak up. And I think women banding together as a group can be more powerful, because there are going to be less repercussions as a group than as a sole voice.
That's a great point. I mean, as you were both sharing your advice, I immediately thought to what you were saying earlier in the conversation about, it was likability tax, the term you used. So I hadn't heard that before, but I'd heard it, aware of the general concept. And to me, my immediate next question is like, okay, you're saying to do these things, but then isn't that exactly what you would deal with? So I appreciate you, Diane, talking about sort of working together, and Allison, your point to like, this needs to be a collective effort. It shouldn't just be more work for women to take on. To that end, let's talk about what organizations can do. What are some organizational practices that you think should be adjusted, or ways that organizations, or maybe even just whether it's at the team level or the entire organization, but what are some things that can happen on a more systemic basis to address the points the two of you have brought up today?
I think from an organizational level, it is very helpful to have women in the spaces where decisions are being made, especially when it comes to policy. It can be really hard to investigate behaviors on an organizational level, but policies and a more simplistic way to start. And having women in those spaces is absolutely crucial. Also investing in sponsorship programs, sponsorship being different from mentorship. Sponsorship has been shown to increase the overall organization's possibility for innovation. However, at a more equitable level, what it does is it creates a foundation of trust at an organization, which is crucial for inclusivity to thrive. And so there's a lot of other benefits to that. But when you have trust and inclusion, performance goes up, retention goes up, creativity and innovation also increase. So having equity and inclusion and diversity at your workplace helps, like I said earlier, it helps everybody. There's no reason why we wouldn't do it.
And Eric, yeah, in addition to what Allison said, I think, a lot of it comes down to the reward system. And I do want to express kind of a caveat about some of my research. Is the studies that I did were in outcome-based systems. So I think you pay more of a penalty for these helping behaviors if you're solely rewarded on things based like sales or publications or billable hours. In other organizations, it may be a little less, but I think at the organizational level, it's really about what is the reward system. And as an example of that, I remember talking to 2 attorneys who are a couple, and one of them said that their reward system was just based on billable hours. The other one said that their reward system was more inclusive, where it had things like, you know, the amount of time you spent mentoring. Were you developing or creating certain processes or systems that made the organization more efficient? So I think the second organization had a much clearer idea of these behaviors benefit everyone. And so let's formally reward it.
So I want to do several things here. One, to everyone watching this, for what Diane just described about the ways that your organization might be set up, and it might be different organizational nuances depending on what kind of work you're doing. We'd love to hear from you in the comments. What has your experience been like, and what are some of those industry-based or function-based nuances that you're experiencing? I also want to encourage everyone tuning in, if you have questions for us, please put those in the chat. We'll do our best to answer those in just a minute. For Diane and Allison, while I wait for some questions for the audience to come in, putting you both on the spot, but do you each have questions for each other, or like follow-up points to what either, you know, the other person said earlier that we didn't have a chance to get to? I know I'm sort of the host here driving that conversation, but want to give you an opportunity to sort of engage with each other too.
Yeah, well, in terms of your point about other points to make, I think, you know, to me, we're talking about a very small dynamic, but I would like to bring it a little more big picture. So the United Nations has a report that shows globally, women do more caretaking than men on every continent, and men have more leisure time than women in every continent. And so even though I feel like the workplace has changed much more than the domestic sphere, to me, because we've been working at this for so long, you know, trying to get women into more positions of leadership, and it's taken decades and there's been very little progress, I start to wonder, do we need to go in a different way? And going in a different way, to me, would be starting to equalize things in the domestic sphere, which comes back to the workplace, because we need to ensure that there aren't career penalties for men or women in the caretaking choices that they make.
Yeah, that's powerful. Allison, what would you add?
Taking it a different direction, there was a comment earlier that popped up on the screen about defining likability and defining these penalties that women face. A really tangible way that you can do that, if you are a man or a woman or anything in between, when you are challenged with somebody saying to you, you need to be more likable, or comments about your personality, a really simple response is, what do you mean? What do you mean by that? Can you tell me specifically what skill set you are looking for? And if you are tempted to give that quote unquote feedback, pause and nail it into a skill set, because personality is not a skill set. However, if somebody's behavior is having an impact on you, that would be different, right? Eric, when you ignored me in the hallway, I felt undervalued. That's different. But giving performance-based feedback needs to be very specific and measurable. And that's one of the best skills that leaders can have, which seems very obvious. However, between 84 and 87% of women at the workplace get feedback on their personality in performance reviews, whereas men is less than 3%. So there's an imbalance there that is absolutely crucial to be acknowledged and thought about.
Yeah, I mean, that's not just an imbalance. That is a dramatic gulf right there. That's right. Not like a 3%, margin of error difference there. Yeah.
And Eric, some of this just highlights, I think, the challenges of being a female in the workplace. You know, and I sometimes liken it to, you're competing in the same athletic sport as a man, but you're wearing an 80-pound backpack, right? It's just not the same experience. And I think so often people don't realize that. And the other thing, you know, Allison mentioned likability. It's almost as if, and research shows, there's this competence likability trade-off. And so I sometimes think hyper competent women try to soften their competence by being helpful, right? Because it makes women a little more palatable to the organization, where, you know, no one has problems with a highly competent man. That's not very helpful.
Right. The old double bind, right? You can be likable but not competent, or competent but not likable. That's generally what women face. If you're going to be confident, you need to do it with a smile and, be friendly, it's added labor. It's just added labor.
Mm-hmm.
We talk a lot about bringing your whole self to the workplace and welcoming whole self leadership. And is that really possible? Is it? That's rhetorical, but things to think about. What expectations are you placing on women in terms of how they behave? And what are the punishments if they don't do it your way?
Great point. I also just want to call out, since you mentioned it earlier, Allison, you sort of informally used the Center for Creative Leadership's situation, behavior, impact feedback model in talking about how to give more specific advice with your example of us in the hallway, which, by the way, was hypothetical.
I was made up.
But so for those of you tuning in, if you search for situation, behavior, impact on ccl.org, you'll find that information on our website, and that model can be very helpful to you. Question that's come in from our audience is around how to be inclusive of all women. Allison, you've mentioned a couple of times that we need to be thinking of all women and the diversity of experience there. But do either of you have any advice on how people can get started or make sure that they're doing that?
I can share that. I'll share my own way of helping to educate myself is to listen to a lot of educators out there and human beings, right? So a woman named Portia Noir is one of my favorite educators. She is a Black queer woman. There's another, if you're on social media, there's another woman who goes by the handle Crutches and Spice. She's a disabled Black woman. So I think broadening your perspective in whatever way that looks like for you, whether it's reading, having conversations, asking your friends who are involved in this space, going on social media, really paying attention to the voices that are different than your own and understanding how many different life experiences there are out there and how people experience the workplace is almost never going to be the same as you. Diane and I are both white women, and I guarantee you we both have different experiences. So the more you can have the conversations and educate yourself, those are really great places to start.
Diane, anything you would add?
Yeah, I think Allison's point about educating yourself is great by external sources, but I feel like in the workplace, educating yourself involves listening to people, right? Not making assumptions, because I think so often people act from a good place, but they may be making assumptions that are not true. So I think it's always best to check in with the person and find out where they are rather than assuming they are where you think they are.
Yeah.
And one more. Go ahead, Eric. One more thing to add is that I had an executive coach ask a group of us this question. It's something I'll give to the audience to think about is when you're listening to people, oftentimes people get vulnerable, especially in ERG spaces, or these types of conversations can bring about certain levels of vulnerability. So asking yourself, what does it mean to celebrate vulnerability? And what does it mean to punish vulnerability at my workplace? Punishing vulnerability can look like a lot of different things, but punishing it could be rolling your eyes, or it could be having a conversation after the fact. It could be not promoting the person. There are micro behaviors and there are bigger behaviors that people can experience when they are vulnerable about what they're going through and their life experiences. So really being aware of how you punish or celebrate it. And celebrating is active listening, like Diane said, just listening. Thank you for sharing that. Thinking about it, internalizing it, doing the work to reflect upon how that might impact you and your organization. Thinking about, are your sidewalks accessible? What do you see when you walk up to the building? There's so much more that you can look at as a human being to broaden your own perspective.
Mm-hmm. Eric, and I would build on that, on what Allison said. One, and returning to a point Allison made earlier about, when you have a more diverse group of people at the top, some of this will not happen, right? Because just that perspective is going to trickle down into the organization. So I think that key is just the representation of diversity in all forms of diversity at all levels. The other thing I would say to people is we know from research on social networks, there's something called the principle of homophily, which means we tend to gravitate toward people that are like us. You know, maybe that has an evolutionary function for survival. I'm sure it probably does, but kind of working against that and actively seek out people that are different from you, whether that is color, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, disability, on whatever spectrum, to just get, broaden your world, I guess, is the bottom line.
Yeah, I think that's a helpful reminder for everyone, especially someone like me who's in a lot of dominant groups and is used to being in those groups often. That's almost all we have time for. I'm not going to wrap up quite yet, but before we close, I want to ask the two of you, are there, I know it's hard to distill this, but if you were going to try and summarize one thing that you really hope people take from this discussion, or maybe I'll frame it a little differently, maybe that would be easier, the next best step they could take after listening to this, what would that be for each of you?
I think I would say talk about it. Talk about what you've heard today so that the message spreads, because awareness is the first step in everything. If we don't bring things to consciousness, nothing will change.
Allison?
You're asking me to pick one. This is hard. I would say
or two.
Okay, two, I get two. So investigate your beliefs about women. You don't even have to tell anyone is the thing. You don't have to, but investigate, what are my beliefs about women? What do I expect women to be like at the workplace or in general, and challenge them. And I would say the second step is to do what Diane said. And for those of you who process internally, you just read anything by Bell Hooks and Diane's research article.
Okay. Eric, can I add one more thing?
Please.
Because I think sometimes we think things have changed because attitudes have changed. So I would say, in addition to examining your attitudes, we know that attitudes are not very predictive of behavior. And behaviors are the things that have to change. So I would encourage everyone to, look at yourself and the things that you do that you have gendered expectations around, right? The things where you say, well, women are better at this, or they should do this, and men are better at this, right? To just kind of examine some of those behaviors, because that's where change happens.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I'm going to add two more of my own, since I let Allison do two. I'd say one thing that anyone tuning in can do, and the three of us on this panel, share this conversation with your networks, because I think this is a great starting place or point of continuation in this discussion about what can be done. So please share this conversation with your networks, whether that's explicitly with the people that you work with or just more broadly your community. The more people we can get this in front of, the better. And then the second thing I want to call out is that I would encourage you to sign up for our upcoming event. It's titled Towards Better Leadership, and the link is in the caption for this video. The event is free, and it's on April 19th. And the reason I'm mentioning it is that the whole point of that conversation is to talk more about the ways that our definitions and understanding of leadership should evolve to be more inclusive, create belonging at work. So it's really a natural follow-up to this discussion, and Diane's research helped frame the way we were thinking about planning that discussion. So encourage all of you to follow the link there and sign up to continue the conversation. But thank you all for tuning in. Thank you in particular to Diane and Allison for being here and sharing your insights and walking us through this really important topic today. But bye, everyone, and thanks so much.
Thank you, Eric. Great to see everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for being here.